Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. This is part 2 of my Making an 1890s Walking Suit series. I will link part 1 above and below. It has a short description of the project. I left off part 1 having finished the main construction of the jacket. I turned to my books to get some inspiration for the sleeves and the cuffs. Originally, I wanted to go with a more fitted sleeve, more common in the late 1890s, but then decided the larger sleeves would work well in balancing the proportions of the ensemble. I kept going back and forth on the design of the sleeve and the fit, which resulted in about 6 mock-ups. Here is the first mock-up. This was self-drafted and was a Frankenstein pattern of a bunch of different elements, which started as a typically Victorian 2-part sleeve. I then toyed with the idea of using these sleeves from Nora Wall's cut of women's clothes. However, I preferred the first option. Going with the 2-part sleeve, I cut it out of the wool, tarlatan and the silk lining. I basted the tarlatan to the wrong side of the wool with long basting stitches. I then did up the side seams on the sleeves, only on the wool fabric pieces. I pinned, basted and sewed by machine. The seams were pressed open and I moved on to the cuffs. I was still using scraps of my friend's jersey velvet dress for the velvet accents, so I had to fit the cuffs the best I could into these scraps. This did mean that one of the cuffs had a seam in it, but piecing is period. I then cut the pattern shape, based on an example in the Harper Bazaar's book, out of wool and tarlatan too. The tarlatan was basted to the wrong side of the velvet. The cuffs have 2 pieces, and at this point I sewed one of the edges together, only the velvet pieces. I then pinned the wool to the velvet right sides together and sewed by machine. The seam allowances are trimmed and pressed and the cuff is turned the right side out, being careful to make the points as pointy as possible. They are then pressed nicely. I use a different scrap of velvet in between the velvet and the iron to avoid crushing the pile. I then sew the last open edge of the cuff together by hand from the wrong side. I don't think this was the most efficient way to do the cuffs, but it worked. The cuffs were then done. I pinned them to the bottom of the sleeve and sewed by machine. I moved back to working on the top of the sleeves. The lining also had the side seams done up and I then inserted it into the sleeve, lacing across the top. I did small running stitches by hand, which meant sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches across the top. The sleeves are then inserted into the armholes and gathered to fit, being careful to align the match points I had worked into the pattern. Once it was gathered to fit, I basted across the top and sewed by machine, being careful not to catch the bodice lining. I finished the bottom of the cuffs by turning the lining seam allowances under and sewing it down by hand, covering the cuff to sleeve seam. I then trimmed back the armhole seam allowance to reduce bulk. I used the jacket lining seam allowance, turned it under and it covered the armhole sleeve. This was stitched down by hand. Time Time to move on to the skirt. Here are some of my inspirations. It seemed that most skirts in the 1890s had simple decorations, such as lines of trims or cording at the hem. I particularly liked the idea of 3 rows of ribbon. Now, I simply used the pattern I had already made for the 1890s Keystone skirt. I'll link that video above and below. It goes into a bit more detail on how to make a basic 1890s skirt. Using the same pattern, I adjusted each piece by extending it outwards a bit more, widening the hem. I cut the pieces out of the wool and a layer of tarlatan. The reason I had not used tarlatan in the other skirt is that tarlatan loses most of its stiffness when washed, and I wanted the other skirt to be washable. However, this one won't get a lot of use, so I thought it's safe to use tarlatan here. I also use this opportunity to cut out my ever important pocket and the skirt placket out of the wool. The most annoying part was to baste every single skirt section to its tarlatan equivalent. This is better than flat, and it was annoying because they barely fit on the largest table in my house, and the floor is all carpeted. And this took a few hours by itself. Once the skirt pieces were ready for assembly, I readied the pocket so that I would not forget it. The pocket is sewn together along one of the side's edges and the bottom. I then covered this seam in lace tape. Moving on to the skirt, I sewed all the seams together, leaving the pocket gap on the side left panel. The pocket is then pinned into the gap and sewn by hand. To finish the seams, I pressed them open and cut one side back, then folding the larger seam allowance over it and under, making a finished edge. This was all pressed nicely. A quick warning not to spray the tarlatan with water, as this makes the stiffening in it gum up and stick to the iron. Steam was okay though. I then felled the seams by hand. I tried on the skirt to mark the hem. I turned it out by 1 inch and pressed and pinned as I went. This is then turned up again by 4 inches. This thicker hem alongside the tarlatan and the trim gives the skirt hem a really good body. I basted the hem into place. To finish the centre back seam, I had to tackle the skirt placket. The placket consists of 2 rectangles of the wool, and I added a layer of tarlatan to one of them to add stability. The seam allowance is 1/2 inch, and this is ironed inwards on one of the long edges on both rectangles. Then they're pinned on the skirt edges and sewn into place by machine. One of them is turned under to the wrong side of the skirt and the other one pressed in half so it sticks out from the skirt. They are finished by hand on the inside. I think I might make a short video about skirt plackets. For the trim, I was still resolved to not buy any velvet, and as we were in lockdown, I could only get one type of black velvet ribbon, which was 1/2 inch wide. However, I thought it would look better if the trim was closer to 1 inch, so I sewed 2 lengths of ribbon together to make one double ribbon. This is not the cleanest, but I think it works well enough. However, I wouldn't recommend it under normal circumstances. I would have just gotten 1 inch wide ribbon. I then marked 2 inches above the hem and pinned the first row of trim in place. This is hand sewn into place on both sides with a small running stitch. I added a second and third row of the velvet ribbon, each 2 inches apart. Although I measured my ribbon carefully, I do think it wavered, bubbled and shrunk when being sewn together, so I ended up with it being a little short sometimes. I just pieced another bit of ribbon to finish this edge. I pinned, basted and sewed up the back seam. I left this for last as it was much easier to add the trim while the skirt could be laid down flat. That seam is also felled. I don't have much advice for pleats, as I always end up fudging them until it looks and fits right, and then mirroring it on the other side. I basted the pleats into place and made sure they looked okay on the dress form. The skirt hem was actually already secured in place by the stitches on the velvet ribbon, so I simply covered the raw edge with some Petersham ribbon I had on hand. I sewed down both edges of the ribbon by hand with a small running stitch. For the waistband, I cut my waist measurement plus the placket edge that sticks out plus seam allowance out of the wool. I didn't interline it, and I made it 1 inch wide to reduce bulk at the waist. The short edges are sewn together, one long edge's seam allowance is ironed inwards and the waistband is ironed in half. I then pinned it to the right side of the skirt and sewed it by machine. The waistband is then turned to the wrong side and the ironed finished edge is sewn down by hand with a whipstick. I added one hook and eye to the skirt as closures. And that is it. The bulk of the work is now done. The next video will be about making the vest, a belt and a hat. I don't have any worn photos as the weather has been a mess, but I should have full footage of the costume on the last video. Thank you for watching.